The university has to be advancing America. Insofar as it's not, they have to be pulled up short, reminded their privileges depend on that. And universities that fail to step in line will have those privileges taken away. Just like Bob Jones University, right? Once the priority of America became equal citizenship for Black people and white people, Bob Jones University was told, you have to get with it or you're losing valuable privileges. And those privileges were taken away and they were not restored until Bob Jones University fell in line. So, that in a way is the model.
Thanks, Gabby, and thanks for the invitation. Telos is a wonderful institution, and I'm honored to be speaking in association with it. So I'll be, in a way, returning to a classic text of critical theory, the tradition that Telos comes out of, as people will see. But first, I'm marking a near anniversary. So this September marks the 60th anniversary of the Berkeley free speech movement, which is really where the kind of campus activism we now more or less take for granted has its point of origin. And so, every campus activism, every campus protest we see today is in some sense a kind of belated reenactment of that kind of primal founding event. And it's worth noting at the outset that it's an interesting fact that campus activism, as we know it, didn't begin with anti-war protests or civil rights advocacy per se, but rather with the rejection of the limits then imposed up until that moment on political expression on campus. So the Berkeley protesters were involved in civil rights activism and other sorts of causes, but their first order of business was to assert the right to engage in this kind of activism and advocacy on campus, which was in fact banned at that point. And so that was the sort of meta debate that got this whole campus activism phenomenon started. And it's worth noting this because it's often complained, and I think with some justice, that debates about campus controversies often devolve into meta debates about the right to speech, and this kind of sidelines the substance. And my friend David Polanski recently made a version of this observation quite compellingly, quoting from David's recent column in the Washington Examiner, quote, "Whether teachers and students have the right to say ridiculous or offensive things is perhaps the least important question to ask. The salient questions are whether universities are meaningfully generating or preserving human knowledge and whether the students are capable of receiving it," end quote. So, there's a reasonable case to be made that much of this kind of, free speech debate about campuses, can be seen as a red herring. So I think there's some validity to this point, but at the same time, it's also true that this sort of meta debate about free speech prefaces the entire modern history of campus protest and activism. And the question that was posed at Berkeley was, did students enjoy First Amendment protection for the full range of expression on campus or not? And so the fallout of those events seemed to imply a resounding affirmative answer, which is why, if you go to the Berkeley website, there's a kind of solemn celebration of this history as part of the university's legacy. The free speech movement won, and its premise that the full range of free expression should be permitted on campus, that students on campus were subject to First Amendment protections for their speech, was taken to have won the day. And this fit in this period to a broader phenomenon, which is the dismantling of the in loco parentis paradigm, which I don't have time to go into, but essentially defines students as, that it defined the university as assuming a kind of parental role, and thus define students as not in their status as students on campus able to exercise full citizenship. And what's going back further in history, I think notable here is that this question of kind of full citizenship or being able to access the full range of rights that are associated with modern citizenship. This kind of brings us back to a foundational text of critical theory, among other things, which would be Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment? And famously, at the outset of this essay, Kant defines enlightenment as, quote, man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. The term here is Unmündigkeit, which literally means nonage, a kind of weird word. In other words, state of being a minor, right? And so this was precisely the state in which students occupied in the in loco parentis regime, right? The state of nonage or of being a minor, of what Kant called Unmündigkeit. And so, for Kant, enlightenment meant the emergence from this state, right? The emergence out of this state. So when the Berkeley protesters successfully redefined the campus as a space in which the full exercise of citizenship could occur, one doesn't have to sympathize with them entirely or regard their impact as entirely beneficent. And as I think I'll sort of suggest, I personally don't, to see that the issue that they raised was not an arbitrary one, but rather a fundamental question about how far the rights defined at the outset of the modern era were to be extended. So in this sense, it fit in squarely with various other conflicts about the extension of rights in the same period. So it was because of the contradictory position occupied by students, stuck in this position of nonage or, of minority, as sometimes it's called, that the new left gurus of the era began to see students as a potential revolutionary vanguard. So one of these gurus was Herbert Marcuse. Now we get into the critical theory foundational text I mentioned. So in the same year as the Berkeley protests, Marcuse published One Dimensional Man, which, among other things that he wrote in this period, was fundamental in kind of assigning students this historical vanguard role, right? So Marcuse in this text demotes the proletariat from the revolutionary vanguard status assigned to it by Marx, claiming that workers had become too integrated into and pampered by advanced industrial capitalism to pose a threat to it any longer. Regardless of whether Mario Savio was consciously hearkening to Marcuse's call for a great refusal when he made his famous machine speech, he and his fellow activists' actions looked like a successful audition for the role of new vanguard. Another text from a year later by Marcuse may be read as offering a kind of further guidance to these new adepts emerging out of the radical student movement of the period. And I refer here to Repressive Tolerance, which in many ways expanded on the thesis of One Dimensional Man, that the ostensible freedoms of advanced industrial capitalist society masked its fundamental unfreedom. At the core of Marcuse's argument is a distinction between tolerance as an end in itself and the objective of tolerance, or its original telos, which, as he claims, was social progress. Referring to the 18th and 19th century struggles for freedom of speech, assembly, and other rights, Marcuse states that, quote, the tolerance which enlarged the range and content of freedom was always partisan, intolerant toward the protagonist of the repressive status quo. In other words, advocacy for these freedoms was not an assertion of a neutral value for its own sake, but a tactic of opposition to dominant forces. But this tactic, Marcuse claims, has become obsolete as of the mid-20th century, because unlike the ancien regime opposed by the earlier liberal reformers and revolutionaries, the repressive status quo has now come to benefit from the norm of pure tolerance. This was because, as Marcuse's Frankfurt School colleagues had first argued several decades prior, the 20th century culture industry, as Adorno and Horkheimer defined it in Dialectic of Enlightenment, it had become a regime of propagandistic mass deception that manufactured consent for the totally administered society. Accordingly, arguments for free expression and other liberal rights now amounted, in effect, to accepting, in Marcuse's terms, quote, the toleration of the systematic moronization of children and adults by publicity and propaganda. In contrast to authoritarian societies, Marcuse argues, totalitarian democracy, his term for mid-20th century American or Western society, bestows formal freedoms on its subjects, but then negates these freedoms through the overwhelming force of technological mass communication, which tips the scales in favor of dominant social forces. By this account, demands for free speech, including those made by Marcuse's young adepts in Berkeley, might ultimately simply serve to reinforce this unfreedom. So this is where Marcuse's paradoxical response in Repressive Tolerance comes in, which was to discard the value of pure tolerance in favor of what he called liberating tolerance, which, as he states explicitly, quote, would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration to movements from the left. He characterizes this proposal as utopian since, quote, no authority, no government exists, which would translate into practice, end quote. However, there was a way in which the very approach he defined would come to influence, whether directly or indirectly, the practical playbook made possible by the left's long march through the institutions. By gaining power and leverage within the entities that control the means of ideological production, the left managed, in some contexts, the university notable among them, to tip the scales of tolerance against the right, just as Marcuse had counseled. The shift from an ostensibly neutral public sphere to one in which certain views are subject to aggressive intolerance seems to follow his prescriptions. Again, whether those implementing this new regime were directly conscious of that or not. So because of this, Marcuse's text has been read as a sort of manifesto of cancel culture or political correctness. The left's critics, in going back to the battles over political correctness decades ago into more recent battles over cancel culture, have tended to fight back by reasserting the value of what Marcuse called pure tolerance. However, I think there has been a gradual and more recently, particularly since October 7th, rather dramatic shift in the American right's the focus of its criticisms of the progressive campus speech regime, which, to kind of borrow the way Marcuse frames this issue, up until relatively recently, most of the criticism of the speech regime from the right and, let's say, sort of liberal center was directed at its censorious towards conservative and conservative coded views. But more recently, the criticisms have shifted, and I'd say, again, particularly dramatically since October 7th, towards permissiveness rather than the permissive side of this regime rather than the censoriousness. If we recall, Marcuse called for tolerance towards movements of the left, intolerance towards movements of the right. So the shift has gone towards the campus speech regime's permissiveness towards extreme speech by leftists, most notoriously celebration of terrorist violence carried out against Israeli civilians. So in other words, if universities practice something like an applied Marcusean regime of liberating tolerance, the criticism they received over recent decades mostly pertained to the intolerant towards the right side of the equation, but now has shifted, I would say, towards the tolerant to the left, towards the left side of the equation. So I think sometimes these criticisms have sort of vacillated between accusations of hypocrisy or inconsistency and overt attempts to simply restrict the speech, the type of speech that has been subject to a more permissive regime. So, and this in turn has provoked a sort of equal and opposite shift on the left, which has pivoted from demands for intolerance towards the right, although it's not to say that those demands have necessarily subsided, but instead what we see emphasized in these more recent post-October 7th strugglers is the demand of, the demand for free speech, but what that really amounts to is a demand for tolerance towards the left, right? For the tolerant side of the applied Marcusean speech regime. So what all of this signals, I would argue, is a crisis of the unofficial campus speech regime that has been in place in recent decades, and hence a new phase of the broader crisis of the university. So here I'd add, though, that the speech regime didn't quite legitimate itself in Marcuse's right and left terms, at least in terms of how it explicitly rationalized and justified itself. Instead, it relied on concepts of victimhood and oppression. So here's where I think a more, a perhaps more relevant articulation of this rationale than the one Marcuse provided, but I think that builds on it, comes from the pioneer and critical race theorist Mari Matsuda. So in her 1989 article, Public Response to Racist Speech, Matsuda argues it is speech by members of or on behalf of, quote, historically dominant groups, unquote, against, quote, subordinated communities, unquote, that should be subject to intolerance, while speech going in the opposite direction, even if hateful or violent, should be subject to tolerance. So this is essentially a version of the punching up versus punching down distinction, to use that shorthand. So what Matsuda offered was a variation on Marcuse's liberating tolerance, but processed through the classifications of civil rights law. So instead of the left being granted extra leeway, it is members of oppressed groups who enjoy what Matsuda calls the victim's privilege. For any speech that generates controversy, simply identify oppressor and oppressed, then ensure that the latter is granted, quote, the tolerance of hateful speech that comes from an experience of oppression. That's Matsuda's term or phrasing, while the former, in other words, the oppressor, is subject to maximum intolerance. So Matsuda defines universities as a special case because college students are, quote, at a vulnerable stage of psychological development, end quote. Accordingly, tolerance of racist speech in this setting is more harmful than generalized tolerance in the community at large. Gesturing back at Berkeley, Matsuda reaffirms support for protesters' speech rights on grounds other than First Amendment absolutism or pure tolerance, precisely because of the power imbalance she sees between students and university administrators, multinational corporations, the US military, and established governments. She says, quote, the free speech rights of students deserve particular deference. In other words, insofar as students can be construed as victims or a kind of oppressed class in relation to these more powerful entities, their speech should be protected. Once they can be construed as victimizers, insofar as they're members of historic oppressor groups, historically dominant groups, they can no longer lay claim to the victim's privilege. So the broader implication of the free speech movement's demand was, again, that intramural speech be protected by the First Amendment in the same manner as extramural speech. The effect of this demand, again, like the other factors that eroded in loco parentis in the same era, was to merge the university with the broader space of rights granted citizenship. A further implication of this move, perhaps not fully evident to the student protesters, was to weaken the specificity of the university's function within society, helping bring us to the situation evoked by Polanski, in which we, quote, mistake the university for society at large, end quote. In perhaps inevitable reaction to this drift and evacuation of purpose, new and insidious forms of paternalism reemerged, not least in the differentiated speech regime outlined by Matsuda, a version, I've argued, of Marcuse's liberating tolerance that is difficult to see as anything other than repressive. Conservative and centrist critics of campus politics have correctly identified the divisive and intellectually stultifying effects of this regime. But recently, it would seem many would simply like to assert some sort of control over it and adjust the dials, applying more tolerance here, more intolerance there. The problem with this isn't inconsistency, but the abdication of a more important and difficult task. The deeper source of what ails the university today is that no one knows what it's for. The integration into the broader realm of citizenship has failed to facilitate its responsible exercise, and only succeeded at eroding its institutional purpose and specificity. In the history of higher education, there have been any number of radical rethinkings of its social function based on wide-ranging public debate, rather than responding to the current crisis with demands to tweak an absurd infantilizing speech regime to suit the polemical needs of a few news cycles. We should reinitiate just such a discussion. And that is all I have to say for now.
Thank you, Geoff. That is a lot for me to think about, and I suspect for the audience as well. I've got questions, and I hope that anyone else with questions will feel free to submit them in the chat whenever you want as we go along. You've heard now about the university's identity crisis. You're about to hear, if I understand correctly, something about the university's identity from Michael Kochin. My friend Michael is up next. Take it away.
Okay, so I just listening to Geoff talk, I thought of the following quote from John Quincy Adams. I was reminded of him because I just came back from my 35th Harvard reunion, and there the president of the Alumni Association mentioned that Quincy Adams was a big guy in the Harvardizing of Harvard. He was the first president of the Alumni Association. So he's pretty much the guy, one of the guys who helped invent the whole concept of alumni back about 200 years ago. But when he was, before that, and before he came back to the US, he was the American minister in Prussia, in Berlin. And he writes the following about Kant to Rufus King, another famous Federalist. The ingenious professor of Königsberg, who preaches atheism and revolution in such hard words that the honest Germans imagine they do not understand him. They are in a predicament something like Cromwell's gentry, who thought he was seeking the Lord when he was only seeking a corkscrew. The professor of the Royal University seeks to spread atheism and revolution and at the same time to keep his place. I believe this is the true glossary to his hard words, right? So we see there's a kind of critique of Kant, right? A very early critique of Kant. This is a very early American reception of Kant. Kant works in an institution. The institution has a purpose, okay? Kant's purposes, however, are opposed to those of the institution. He wants to keep his place in the institution, benefit from the institution while subverting it by preaching revolution and atheism. And when we try to think about what Quincy Adams might have meant by revolution, we have to remember that he had actually served the revolution. He'd gone with his father, John, as a diplomat. He'd been his father's secretary serving the revolutionary American regime when it was still fighting the British. So what revolution here means is very complicated. In what sense Quincy Adams means to oppose it is very complicated, but he certainly means to oppose Kant's what he understands to be Kant's understanding of revolution. Okay, now in 1951, the 25-year-old veteran and a Yale alumnus, William F. Buckley, published his first book, God and Man at Yale. Buckley scandalously claimed that instead of preaching true religion and free market capitalism, Yale professors were preaching atheism and collectivism. If we're stuck in 2024 think, we might suppose that Yale's defenders responded with a resounding so what. In fact, while loyal Yaleys did more or less shrug off the charge of collectivism, they denied the charge of atheism. McGeorge Bundy of the class of 41, by then teaching at Harvard, asserted in his scathing review of Buckley that, quote, Yale is more religious than the rest of Protestant America and more religious than it was a generation ago. In 1951, for God, for country, and for Yale was still that university's lodestar. And if you want to sum up what I have to say in one sentence, I think that's a perfectly fine set of purposes. In fact, that should be the purpose, everybody's purpose, as I'm going to explain. Every university's purpose, not Yale, but fill in your university. In his recent book, You Can't Teach That, The Battle Over University Classrooms, Princeton, but soon to be Yale professor Keith Whittington makes his own Alabama law professor Paul Horowitz's claim that universities are First Amendment institutions because of their central role in generating, investigating, and promulgating ideas. Okay, and I'm going to agree with Whittington and Horowitz that universities are First Amendment institutions, but I think they come in a different way. I think the whole notion that free speech, there's some peculiar relationship between universities and free speech is mistaken. Insofar as we know the constitutional and religious history of America, we should be suspicious of Whittington and Horowitz's seemingly innocuous claim. The First Amendment comes to us from an era when universities had not yet claimed for themselves a central role in generating and investigating ideas. Indeed, these universities, American universities, were elected to promulgate ideas, but the ideas America's universities claimed to promulgate were the truth and light of Protestant Christianity. Harvard's Veritas, Columbia's Lumen, and Yale's Lux et Veritas, or in Hebrew, Urim Vetumim. America's greatest scientist of her founding era was Benjamin Franklin, who never attended or taught at a university, but he did help found one, the University of Pennsylvania, alma mater of our two last presidents, whose motto is classical rather than Christian, but still edifying. Leges sine moribus vane, laws without morals are useless. Universities do have an important role in the original understanding of the First Amendment, not as centers for free inquiry, but as religious and educational institutions. Universities were institutions for launching young people into adulthood as credentialed bachelors with strong faith and solid morals, and for training clergy as credentialed masters or teachers to pass down that faith and morals. What faith and which morals, right? Part of the genius of the First Amendment as originally conceived was that it left that question for the peoples of the states and the state governments to answer for themselves. Congress, meanwhile, would protect those institutions by laws and even subsidize them by land grants from the lands to be wrested or stolen from the Indians. But the assumption that was that whatever the pluralism of religious doctrines, men and women who sincerely sought to live and contribute to the same society would converge in their moral views on workable and justifiable principles and practices. Now, universities, whether public or private, are privileged by law. The most valuable privileges are those that attract money in the form of donations and tuition. Universities are exempt from corporate income taxation, which enables them to receive tax-free income in the form of donations and accumulate endowments. Universities also have the privilege of accreditation, the legal recognition that their certified graduates are themselves worthy of privileges. It's accreditation that attracts students, for without that vital legally recognized diploma, those graduates cannot become dentists or pharmacists or public school teachers or lawyers or physical therapists. Privileges have to be justified by obligations. In a democracy, it's the role of voters and the officials they elect to monitor and, where necessary, reform those privileges and hold privileged institutions accountable for the fulfillment of those obligations. One might claim, and Professor Whittington probably would, that among these obligations is the obligation to offer academic freedom. Every university should, and public universities, Whittington claims, must, allow individual faculty to seek the truth according to their own lights and teach whatever of those truths their faculty find important and useful, right? Their faculties, rather, find important and useful. It's true that in the second half of the 20th century, universities became the principal centers for generating and investigating ideas, and in that role were declared for core First Amendment institutions. But you should be suspicious of any constitutional understanding originating in the second half of the 20th century, because in that period, the very notionalism of constitutionalism was most controversial and came under the most sustained attack, not only from judges and politicians, but from professors at law school. Never before or since have so many Americans believed that, quote, the Constitution means what the Supreme Court says it means, which is, of course, that's not a quote from Whittington. In fact, I'm not sure really where it's a quote from, but it's an expression of an attitude. That quote is an evisceration of constitutionalism and the rule of law, right? Constitutionalism means that every official is subordinate to the Constitution, including the judges. They're not the source of the Constitution. They're subjects of the Constitution. And the rule of law has to apply to everybody, including or even especially judges. However, Whittington operates elsewhere, and I think in some ways his views in this book are very different from how he operates elsewhere. In this book, he treats the First Amendment in relation to academic freedom not according to its original intention, but primarily according to what Supreme Court justices from Robert Jackson's ascension to William Brennan's retirement have made it. Those judges supported their legal reasonings with dicta about how the freedoms they endorsed would benefit society. Whittington does not examine which of those dicta are true, but treats them as if the authority of their pronouncers made them true enough. That might do in a legal brief, but not in social science or in the kind of policy discussion that social science should subserve. In this era, where academic freedom of individual professors has come closest to being entrenched as judge-made constitutional law, so-called, actual progress in understanding of ourselves and our world has slowed and in some cases reversed. As Steve Saylor has written concerning the intellectual eminence Edward Said, whose attitude and rhetorical power and rhetoric powered this year's campus protests, Quote, this is Saylor, knowledge is power, Edward Said believed, so he wanted Westerners to be more ignorant about his homeland in order that they would have less power over it. In fact, there's an irresolvable tension between education and the unfettered pursuit of truth. Anyone who educates has to believe that they know what is important and true, while anyone who inquires has to think there are things they don't know that are important enough to spend the time to find out. Whittington repeatedly acknowledges that what the First Amendment protects in the classroom is not unfettered classroom discussion, but the right of the faculty, which means the whole body of relevant professors, to fetter classroom discussion as they deem wise. Right? If you're in a faculty of architecture, you can't teach architecture your way. You have to teach architecture the way the faculty of architecture wants you to teach it. And that's what, according to Whittington anyway, the First Amendment protects in the classroom. Wise enough to know that wisdom requires more than learning, the Christian originals of universities separated their faculties of philosophy from the faculties of theology, right? If I was going to choose a context to assign for the seminar, I would have chosen the conflict of the faculties. The presuppositionless pursuit of knowledge was confined to the faculty of philosophy, while the faculty of theology formulated and taught the dogmas, the teachings of God as revealed in the canonical scriptures. The rulers of the university came, of course, from the graduates of the faculty of theology, and that was true by and large of public universities also, until pretty recently. Whether as presidents, deans, rectors, or in the case of sectarian universities, external ecclesiastical visitors or overseers, ensuring that the university did not throw off the yoke of divine wisdom. In our pluralistic democracy with no federally established church, democracy has to take the place of hierarchy, right? The people, vox populi, vox Dei. That's the voice of the people is the voice of God. That's from the Latin translation, the Hebrew book of Isaiah. The only legitimate oracles of that so-called divine voice, or, scare quotes, divine voice, are those men and women anointed for office by popular election, and officers those men and women in turn appoint or elect. But just as Americans are and always have been religious pluralists, they are and always have been higher education pluralists. They have, in their wisdom, mostly left it up to every denomination, every board of trustees, and every state board of regents to understand God and country in their own way. This pluralism is not license. Universities have valuable privileges, and they can only justify and retain those privileges by advancing the cause of America, one nation under God. Every university in America is a settler colonial university, granted valuable privileges by settler colonial legislature, executive, and judiciary. In return for those privileges, universities are obliged to advance the cause of the American people, themselves, settlers or immigrants or the descendants of immigrants. Some, of course, coerced into that immigration and some voluntary. How should universities advance the cause of America? In our pluralistic system of higher education, that's mostly a question that university administrators and trustees have to answer. And in fact, when they are reminded of their obligation to advance the cause of America, university heads acknowledge that obligation. Even if, like every other human being reminded of an obligation, they would unconscionably prefer to be judges in their own case of their success at fulfilling it. So they acknowledge that they are obliged to advance the cause of America. They just don't want to be judged for how well they're doing it. And that, of course, is not okay. One party to an obligation doesn't get to decide how well they're doing their job. It's the job of citizens and officials to ensure that universities are run by sincere and competent men and women who accept the obligations that come with universities' privileges. But mere acceptance is not enough. We need to demand the best of our universities, and when they repeatedly and continually fall short of the best, we must carefully and deliberately alter their privileges, alter our mechanisms for oversight of the use of those privileges, or both. Unless we can return universities to their original mission of fostering religion and morals, America will not survive. As John Adams wrote, John Adams, father of John Quincy, who I quoted at the beginning, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Or to quote the motto of the first federally chartered college, Ohio University, funded in part out of the college lands of which Ohio's Indians were despoiled, religio doctrina civilitas, pre omnibus virtus, religion, learning, civility, above all, virtue. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kochin, for those stimulating remarks. I look very much forward to the conversation to follow amongst the three of you, and I may pitch in a little, after which we segue into Q&A with the audience. Again, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. It's time for our respondent now to have his 15 to 18 minutes. Jacob Siegel, I can't wait to hear your response.
Thank you, Gabby. I'm looking forward to trying to address and synthesize some of what came from Geoff and Michael. So let me start off by providing what I think is my own analytic framework for what is going on university campuses at the moment, which is not the Constitution or the sort of teleological orientation of the university within a constitutional order that Michael spoke about, and it is maybe borrows from critical theory in some ways, but it's also, I think, a departure from Geoff's framework. And my understanding of what's going on campus at the present is that you would not have a, let's say, 7-month-long national protest movement, encampment movement of this scale without the tacit permission of the state. So I don't think there is any real pure distinction to be drawn between the prerogatives of the student protest movement and the policies of the United States government under the Biden administration. That is not to say either that the students are merely an instrument of the state. I don't believe that. It's not to question the sincerity of the individual protesters, nor is it even to really make any normative judgments at all about their claims. I'm just saying, as a matter of fact, that it seems to me utterly implausible that a student protest movement of this scale that was, for instance, protesting for the rights of the Russian government to occupy Ukraine, that kind of protest movement, even though it might have precisely the same rights-based claims to occupying campuses, even though it might have precisely the same technical and procedural arguments to make, would, based on political considerations, have been shut down, I don't know, within a week or 2 weeks. And so you can find somewhere in between the 2 weeks, for the example I just gave, with a kind of pro-Putinist movement, and the anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian movements, you can sort of rank within that gap any number of other political movements and make your guesses about how long they would have lasted. Excuse me. But the point ultimately is that the determination on how much leeway they are given to enact this kind of national protest movement, which is clearly coordinated, which clearly involves direct participation from some groups with direct connections to Hamas and terrorist movements, clearly involves a large number of activists who are not students at all, some of whom are funded by foreign governments. The tolerance for this is based on a perceived alignment between the protest movement and the prerogatives of the Biden administration. So that's where I start with this. So it's hard for me to evaluate the specific speech-based considerations without prefacing it by saying that. So then that leads actually directly into the really, I thought, very interesting framework Geoff established in terms of the university's absorption of the kind of Marcusean ideal of repressive tolerance. So if you understand the discursive framing of the students as being an expression of this idea of repressive tolerance. And I think that's right for exactly the reason Geoff laid out, which is essentially that what you see is not simply that you are supposed to be intolerant of right-wing groups. I mean, Marcuse there's no need to be euphemistic about this. Marcuse is so direct about it, we ought to equal his directness. You're supposed to be intolerant of right-wing groups that oppose progress and tolerant towards left-wing groups. And so this is exactly what we see. And we also see this vacillation between the claim that there is the claim that groups are being censored, and then the claim that groups are being pandered to or permitted. And on the flip side, from the kind of student movement itself, we see this vacillation between the demand to censor, right? The demand to enact BDS, for instance, right? Because the same student groups that are involved in these campus protest movements now, and these encampments now, led what was the sort of archetypal cancel culture political movement of the last decade and a half, which was the BDS movement, which was not simply about divesting from the state of Israel, but was all about demanding the cancellation of performances by Israeli singers, demanding total cultural cancellation of Israeli academics. So all of these people who had been involved in that are now have completely flipped around and have gone from the censoriousness of BDS to demanding maximum permissiveness to the point of demanding that they be able to dictate to administrations now that they're leading their own protest movements that are violating both campus regulations and, in many cases, state, in some cases, federal laws. So that's one dichotomy. But within that, or from that, you see there are all these other sort of related dichotomies. So oppressor versus oppressed, how that determination is made. You can see how the Marcusean repressive tolerance framework maps onto all of these other dichotomies. So, oppressor oppressed is perhaps sort of the most obvious of those, but it's not the only one. I don't think, however, that ultimately the grounding of this ideological position is the hierarchy of oppressor versus oppressed. Ultimately, I think it's grounded in the sense that there is a revolutionary subject. It's grounded in the beginning of the post-Marxist turn. It's grounded in the idea that the proletariat had failed and the students were now the revolutionary subject. And that, I think, is the foundational layer, because that's what brings us to the question of what is the university, right? If the university is an institution for inculcating good citizenship, a moral education, technical skills, in the case of the first military academy in the United States, West Point, which originally produced engineers when America was still, had a kind of quasi-religion of engineering. If that is the point of the university, and this is not to make any normative claims about that either, because in a minute I have some criticisms of that model also. But if that's the basis of the university, then, as Michael pointed out, what you're really trying to maximize is the ability of the faculty to inculcate those values, not the latitude for students to advance the revolutionary cause. So it's only with the turn from the idea that there is a more or less defined nation, already defined nation, America, which is a constitutional republic or a constitutional democracy, if you prefer, and that the contingent aims of that nation may change from generation to generation, but the political and maybe even metaphysical ethos of that nation is more or less locked in, and insofar as it evolves, can only evolve in a kind of organic process through the incremental changes within the citizenry itself. It's from that to the idea that all of society is the grounds for a revolutionary struggle, and that the students are now the primary actors within that revolutionary struggle, and that all of history is the unfolding of this struggle. That's the first essential step that has to be taken, from which all of these other paradoxes or dichotomies of repressive tolerance, of the kind of oppressor versus oppressed dichotomy, that's the one that sets up everything else. It's from democratic citizen to revolutionary subject. Now, so that's, I think, the basis for evaluating that, what's going on. And within that framework, it's very hard to bring up the ways in which what's happening is unconstitutional or un-American. It's not that it's wrong. It's just you're appealing to a king that's already abdicated the throne. So this leads me back to something that I've discovered in my research into the book I'm working on about the evolution of informational control politics in America and the disinformation industry. And that is the absolutely critical role that the academy played in pushing the Wilsonian progressive agenda during the First World War, in particular, when it was in fact quite unpopular. There were, depending on what polls you look at, there were periods after 1916, after the declaration of war, when the opposition to the war in the U.S. and of course, Wilson had won re-election by opposing America's entry into the war, by promising to stay out of the war. Then he, for reasons that I don't believe were cynical, I think that Wilson's reasons for changing his mind made sense to him at the time. And in fact, there was a very strong case for it. But nevertheless, there was this abrupt change. There was a very strong anti-war movement in America that united socialists, Eugene V. Debs, with German Americans, who were the largest minority in the country at the time, something like 25%, and sort of Midwestern nativists. And so there's a very powerful anti-war movement. And what ended up happening was you had this sort of whole of society effort to support the progressive agenda. And the reason why this is relevant is not only because it pulled in the universities in a direct way, it's because Wilson was the first academic president the country ever had. Wilson was a product of academia, and a strange product of academia, because he was also, the son of Christian ministers and was himself deeply Christian in his moral and political ethic. But he was also the president of Princeton University, and he also had, a view, let's say, of the American political system that reflected exactly the kind of progressive academic outlook that we know today. He once talked about a lot of nonsense about the inalienable rights of the individual, right? So he was not somebody who saw himself as beholden to constitutional restraints necessarily when there was a moral cause on the line. And the expression of that during the war was the largest program of censorship in American history at that time, which is what we had during the First World War with the Espionage Act and then the Sedition Act. And during all of that, universities played quite an active role. So there was somebody named Guy Stanton Ford, who was the dean of the graduate school at the University of Minnesota, who led up some of the sort of government propaganda efforts on behalf of the Wilson administration. Columbia University at one point estimated that something like 70 plus faculty members were involved in the war effort. So So I bring all of this up not to say that just because progressivism in the Wilson administration co-opted at least significant parts of academia and led their own censorship campaigns at the beginning of the century, that therefore freedom of inquiry is inherently illegitimate or is corrupted from the beginning. I don't think that. I basically agree at a values level with what Michael said. All made quite a bit of sense to me. However, there is a political ethic in this country mitigating against achieving that vision of the university that does not start in the 1960s, that starts actually long before that, at least with the Wilson administration. And the change that occurs in the 1960s is the introduction of the student body as a revolutionary subject. So what you have is this dynamic that you see play out in a number of different arenas of liberatory politics, where the liberated subject does not become the equal of the rest of society, but in the act of being liberated, attains a special status of rights, a different status of rights, and is seen as having a particular role within the enactment of a moral drama within the society. So the liberation of the students from the in loco parentis model, the liberation of the student from being the kind of passive recipient of the tutelary institution, doesn't make the student the equal. How could it, right? That's a kind of absurd premise. The student is paying, the student is subject to certain regulations. At the same time, however, it's not viable in political terms for the student to be explicitly subordinated. So the student ends up gaining a kind of special, quasi-ontological status as the surrogate for the proletariat, as the surrogate revolutionary actor who can't be subject to all the normal restraints we would expect of somebody who is merely receiving education from educators who are their better. The student has to be, in some sense, the moral superior of their educators. The student has to be the one leading the moral drama. So I guess I don't know how much time I've taken up. I imagine a bit at this point, but I guess what I would say is, and maybe this can open it up into some questions. What I would ask is, if what I have said has any merit at all, Michael, and if what we're dealing with is not simply a kind of transgression of constitutional norms, but a change in form of government that makes those transgressions, if not irrelevant, then at least unenforceable or unpunishable in effect. What is the political response that might restore to the university the kind of role that you have proposed? And then what I would ask Geoff is, Geoff, how do you think, I wonder, the student body who has sort of absorbed this repressive tolerance ethic, how do you think they conceive of themselves in relation to the universities and in relation to the state? Probably not in the way I've described, so I wonder how you think they see it.
I think the situation's a little more hopeful than you said, because I think if you actually talk to the people who run universities, to presidents and trustees, even of some of the most liberal universities, they're just to defend their privileges, they're going to have to talk about country, and they really also have to talk about God and morality too. They really can't get away from that. And you could even see that when the President of Columbia was brought up, and there was this whole theological discussion about blessing, do you really want to be one of those cursed people who curse the Jews? And she says, no, we don't want to go there. So, they can be brought up short, and they still believe these things. I actually don't think the world has changed all that much since George Bundy said to Buckley, Yale is a more godly institution than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So Yale may be a less godly institution than it was in 1951, but it still has those commitments, and the people who run it understand the centrality of those commitments if you make them, if you force them to do it. Okay. And that's basically what I think we need to do. In other words, these people need to explain how what they're doing advances the cause of America. That's what they have to do. And there are all sorts of ways to force them to do that. Now, when they do that, they may come up with, it's funny because when I talked about this stuff at Hillsdale a few weeks ago, somebody pointed to the same thing that you pointed to, that it looks like these protests are coordinated. It looks like the state is involved in some way. It looks like they're intended by the administration to advance the administration's political purpose. And so somebody could say in defense of these protests, we're just doing something that we think is advancing foreign policy as we think it should be advanced. And the evidence that this is reasonable is that we really have the administration behind us. Now, like at the end of the day, my view is if somebody is sincere about that, then the pluralist thing means you have to let them do what they want. And it's worth remembering, right? Marcuse worked for the CIA, right? This whole project is, you can't really disentangle it from the American national security state and the way that it advances a progressive agenda abroad in order to advance a progressive agenda at home, advances a progressive agenda at home in order to advance a progressive agenda abroad. Also, like Marcuse, it really never really has a trouble finding enemies on the left. It is aimed at enemies on the right. It has trouble finding enemies on the left. And so all this is very complicated. But, to talk about it seriously makes you seem like a nutcase. So that's a problem. But So I think you can just bring people up short and say, look, the people who run these things, force them to admit this. The second thing I want to do, and in this way, I realized I only really understood this today, but Stephen Turner, who hopefully you guys will have on at some point, understood this before me and sent me a paper today where he explains this, that all of these problems about academic freedom, the way we think about them, come in to the university, into the progressive university. Academic freedom is Lehrfreiheit. What is Lehrfreiheit? It comes from the German university. The German university is an institution of an unfree society. Okay? And so we shouldn't be surprised that these norms, that these practices fit poorly with a free and democratic society, because that's not where they were developed. So what I want to do is what, and Turner mentions this, basically you have to look at the university the way Philip Hamburger looks at other parts of the administrative state. Right? Philip Hamburger, the law professor at Columbia, extremely radical critic of the administrative state, basically wants to undo the whole thing in a formal sense, whatever that means, sort of redo it in a practical sense in a constitutional basis. The same has to be done with the university as it is, which I agree with Jacob. Jacob's described it very well, and Wilson and all that. And all that has to be unwound. Okay? And the whole thing has to be rebuilt on constitutional foundations, on democratic foundations. Okay? And I think that can be done. All right? I think that can be done in the same way that Philip Hamburger thinks the whole administrative state, of which the university is an intimate part, can be unwound, and the government carrying on the way that government carries on those functions can be rebuilt.
So one thing I actually wanted to bring this up, but I realized it would expand the scope of the paper too far and be too ambitious, but I was originally going to bring this up in some part of this paper, but in listening to Jake's remarks, I couldn't help but think of a term coined by Telos founder Paul Piccone, which is artificial negativity, where, I think essentially your initial remarks about what's going on here seem to point to some, which and Piccone, develops this, as far as I recall, largely in response to, or as a kind of critique of Marcuse's one-dimensional man, right? And essentially an argument that by the time Marcuse had sort of described this one-dimensional society, it had ceased to exist, right? And it was, what he was describing there was a kind of transitional phase, which was indeed a period of crisis rather than stasis, as Marcuse claimed, and what in fact seemed to be these kind of these negations emerging from within it, including the radical student movement, were in fact manifestations of this artificial negativity, which is a kind of self-correction, or that the system needed negativity to kind of restabilize itself and prevent itself from these kind of counterproductive overreach, right? So this is I don't want to take too much time going into this thesis, but I think this is a really productive way of thinking about a lot of these phenomena, including student and campus protest, and that there is a kind of, as I understood Jake's analysis, there's a sense in which these are, and going to Jake's question, which I'll try to answer in a few ways, how do they conceive of themselves? Well, in a sense, I think they do conceive of themselves. If you look at what they're sort of practically demanding, which, I think often is, it's an interesting kind of, it reveals certain things about their sort of confused self-conception of like the student today, right? Which is on one hand, the kind of customer, right? Who is exerting the prerogative of a customer. Now, of course, this is actually kind of a misunderstanding of how universities are funded, right? But there's kind of this idea that, okay, because we're customers of these institutions, we should have some kind of say in where the money goes, right? Like, we are paying for this thing we morally disapprove of, and therefore, we should be able to kind of assert our ability to, and of course, that's not actually really how any of it works, but that is the way that it's conceived of, right? It doesn't work that way because, in fact, with these elite institutions, it's essentially actually the endowment that's that's kind of generating surplus, which is then used to fund this extremely expensive education, right? And so, point being, on one level, they're and you can almost see this as like they're conceiving of themselves as like offering a kind of correction, right? That there's not actually a fundamental critique of the system. There's sort of a sense that like we're coming in here and identifying something we claim is immoral or problematic about how it functions, and we're demanding that be readjusted, right? So, in some sense, there's kind of there's a self-conception that kind of matches this idea almost, where the function of these protest movements is to kind of recalibrate. It's to kind of offer a kind of rationalizing recalibration of the system. And so, I don't know, that's kind of one way of thinking about it, that I think even their self-conception sort of reflects on one level. But then, there's kind of this interesting, just going back to the question about, how they're conceiving of themselves. I think there is the revolutionary vanguard, self-conception, which, I think is interesting in regard with regard to the sort of two texts that I discuss, primarily the Marcuse and this Matsuda, where she coins the victim's privilege concept. And, what's notable there is that she, again, sort of frames the demand for the student's rights as the idea that the student occupies a kind of disempowered position, right? And that the student kind of deserves rights because there's an imbalance between the student's power, and like that the student doesn't deserve rights as a citizen in Matsuda's account, because in fact she wants to, even more broadly in society, like define hate speech as sort of prosecutable, as subject to criminal penalties that would not, in her account, be in contradiction with the First Amendment. So, instead, she wants to define students, the deference to students' free speech as proceeding from the imbalance between their position and the position of the entities that they're protesting, right? So it's kind of this, and it fits in with this kind of broader, like, sort of equity engineering, this kind of equity social engineering project that I think infuses a lot of these, a lot of different agendas and sort of, projects that kind of fall under this umbrella. So, Yeah, I mean, I think that there is this kind of sense of that as of occupying a position that's and this goes exactly to your point about that the student is somehow not the tutelary that again I think it's important to go back to the 60s, right, and look at how the students conceived of what they were doing then, which was kind of to reject this like infantilization, right? And I mean, it's interesting, as I recall, I think the 68 France protests, Paris protests were originally like it partly had to do with sex segregated dorms, right? Like an objection to sex segregated dorms. So there were kind of these objections that just had to do with like rejecting this kind of infantilization and demanding some kind of prerogative of adulthood. And then also a lot of it had to do with like putting themselves on the level of the faculty, right? And anyway, so there was this kind of attempt to reject this model, but then in some sense that's in contradiction with the function and basic just like institutional reality of the university itself. So it resolves itself, as I think you said, kind of through this weird situation where the student, remains or is sort of infantilized in new ways, but at the same time is also kind of enshrined as some sort of leading actor in this kind of moral drama, right? And is framed as the kind of moral superior, like the voice of conscience, right? And so I think that's quite important to this self-conception. But then, the other thing that's striking is on another level, the fact that there's been, it's been brought up endlessly that like, if you look at all these protesters, they're like mostly masked, right? Which is, there's so much to say about that in terms of this like odd hangover from kind of COVID era norms, but then how that blends with this like Antifa sort of, pursuit of anonymity, the sort of black bloc anonymization of the protester. And so it's and then the fact that there's kind of this odd, this kind of odd creation of these encampments as some sort, they become like safe spaces, right? And they have to be kind of protected from incursions that might threaten that status. I mean, there was like a bizarre episode of one of these where supposedly somebody in the encampment was allergic to bananas. I don't know if anybody saw this, but it was like this really weird thing where they were like, oh yeah, there's someone in here that's allergic to bananas, and like the counter protesters are like leaving bananas around. So, this kind of seemed to emblematize this. So there is this kind of this vulnerability, right, which I think is described very much in, if you read Matsuda's essay, where she talks about like why students need particular deference in various ways, and why situationally they can be conceived of as like a victim class per se, but then within that you have to differentiate between the different levels of sort of victimhood. But as a whole, they should be conceived of as a victim class to be protected from these more powerful entities. But she also says that part of what makes students vulnerable is their deep dependence on the university for a sense of identity and belonging. And so that means that anything the university does or says, when the university or when it fails to, respond to like an incident of offensive graffiti, right? That's in some sense like an attack on on everyone within the university, because their whole sense of identity and belonging is attached to it. And so, I think you can see this exact kind of sensibility play out. And, then the final thing is this kind of the other aspect of the anonymization, which is that it has to do with another function of the university, right? Which is or the elite university, right? As a career pathway, right? And that it has to do with actually protecting your ability to, pursue careers, in elite field, sort of professional fields, without this somehow being a black mark against you. And that, this is kind of interesting finally in relation to like this whole question, right? Which is, insofar as like the student is conceived of as a moral vanguard, as a kind of, leading actor in this moral drama, the participation in these kinds of actions can become a kind of, line on your resume, right? So it can become a kind of a way of marketing yourself, of selling yourself, of using your career. But there is this ambiguity around it, right? Where there's also a fear that this might not always be the case, and so there needs to be some kind of hedging against that possibility.
Yeah, we're getting somewhere, and we have a question, I think, that from David Pan, the editor of Telos, which I think fits here very well indeed. Mark, are you out there? Can David be admitted to the Zoom room to pose the question himself, or I can read it if not? But David, great. What's on your mind?
So wonderful presentations. Really enjoyed them all. Thank you to everybody. I was just wondering about this political aspect that seems to be, I think, in all of your presentations, overshadowing the issues of academic freedom and free speech, where I think you're all characterizing the conflict as really primarily a political one, in which there is some senses in which the university administrations, as well as Jacob mentioned the Biden administration, have their own sense of mission, in a sense, and that they're establishing that as a political perspective that's suppressing an alternative one. And that the typical critique is that they're suppressing, that they would be suppressing somehow freedom of speech, academic freedom. But in fact, what you're all saying is, no, that's not the issue. The issue is that the values that they're suppressing are the right values, and we should be doing it the other way. We should be suppressing their values, and we need to be defending our values. Yeah, is that, have I got it right?
Well, what I would say is that freedom of speech is not an ultimate right. It's a right that's embedded in it's only given meaning by a political framework that has other values. And so if what you're doing on campus now is isolating freedom of speech and defending and promoting freedom of speech within an environment that is otherwise totally politicized, where every domain of that environment is subsumed into some kind of ideological mission, and then you're parachuting in or you're insisting that within that environment that freedom of speech be respected, it's not even that freedom of speech ought not to be respected in that environment. It's just that the meaning of the protection of freedom of speech within the totally politicized environment is just a term of political warfare. It's just extending the domain of political warfare. If the freedom of speech is not subordinate to an ethic of inquiry at a university, if the purpose of freedom of speech is not to expand the domain of inquiry, to protect the freedom of inquiry, if instead the freedom of speech is just to provide armaments to the group that's been temporarily displaced in the political battle, then maybe you could argue that it's still worth doing. I don't know what it has to do with a humanistic education.
So my view is kind of different from Jacob's. First of all, I think that the mistake is regarding some deep connection between what universities do and freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is something that, and for that matter, universities and free inquiry. I think universities are mainly educational institutions. American universities are institutions of secondary education, not tertiary education. That's another part of the mistake in the import of Lehrfreiheit, is that the German universities institution of tertiary education, it originally only accepted the graduates of gymnasiums, okay, where people completed their secondary education. All right, and then they were adults, and some of those adults went on to university. And American universities are by and large institutions of secondary education, and therefore can't fulfill their mission if they don't acknowledge that. And that fits in an interesting way in the whole sexuality thing, but perhaps we don't want to go there. So at the same time in the 50s that there was this effort to purge the university of communist professors, the lawmakers were very careful to say that the Communist Party remains legal, that advocacy of communism remains legal. Okay, none of this touched. If you wanted to have the party school, the party summer camps, all of that was understood to be constitutionally protected under the First Amendment rights of freedom of speech, of freedom of assembly, of right of petition. Okay, but it was another question what any of that had to do with the university. Right. So I think that's the way I want to go. Okay, that's the way I want to go. Yes, freedom of speech is very important. Yes, freedom of inquiry is very important. These things cannot be central to the university. The university cannot engrave them as its mission. The university's mission has to be something else. The First Amendment, it relates to universities mainly in terms of the religion clause, and mainly that it has to protect the rights of different universities to advance the cause of the Americans, one nation under God, in their own way. That's what universities are for. Freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, freedom of the press. These things are all things that exist in their own institutions that work their own ways and that have to be regulated in very different ways with very different notions in mind. That's where I want to go. And so, yeah, it's going to look like what David Pan said. It's going to look like coming down on the universities and making them do something very different. Okay, but that's because I think the university has misunderstood its purpose. The university of the progressive era is fundamentally a misbegotten institution, and it has to be called. The American university has to be called back to its American roots. And I think, as I said before, I think it's worth it. I think it's worth trying. I think there's enough prospect for this politically that it can be tried.
But I guess it sounds like, and I pretty much agree with this, is that universities really have to be understood as really servants of the state in some sense, right? But the state properly understood as what we want to understand it, a liberal democracy that defends the values of a liberal democracy, and that universities will always in some sense be beholden to the state. And so if somehow the Biden administration is enforcing a certain set of rules, then the universities will have to kind of fall in line. But the real battle is really a political battle about what our state is. And this is kind of the party political kind of question, and that the real struggle is not within the universities. Really, the real struggle is really a political battle between, different conceptions of what it means to be an American and what liberal democracy is. I mean, that sounds like what you're kind of converging on, but I just wanted to hear it.
2 thumbs up.
Okay, great, thank you.
Great. How is it that students came to be regarded as an oppressed class? Was there some progress from the proletariat as the revolutionary subject to in the States, the race, the now we call it people of color. I'm not sure what the correct terms are anymore. And now it's students. How is it that students came to be regarded as an oppressed class and I would throw in as a revolutionary class? You've mentioned this, but Mila, I think, rightly asked, can you say how that comes about?
I can speak to this. So I think it's not so much sequential as there's kind of this, among new left intellectuals, there's sort of a kind of shopping around for, who's going to be the historical vanguard. And often it's not so much that there's one, but that there's this idea. I mean, this is, you can see different versions of it. Starting through the 60s, there's an influential book called Hegemony and Socialist Strategy from the 80s, I believe, that's kind of significant in articulating a version of this, that, instead of sort of there being in this Marxian sense, this sort of historical destiny of the proletariat, singular historical destiny of the proletariat, there's instead this kind of stitching together of different groupings that together are supposed to compose some sort of progressive coalition. And, this is it's both a sort of theoretical development, which you can see again starting in the sort of early 60s already, because basically the idea is that and it's an important, part of what's important is the shift to the sort of idea of marginality or the marginalized, as opposed to, the point of the proletariat is that they're exploited, right? That they have this particular economic relation to the system that is contradictory and therefore, has to be sublated in some, through some kind of preordained Hegelian process. But, instead there's a shift to kind of the margins, like what are the things in the margins that can in some way challenge the center, right? And can kind of displace the center. And so the student, I think, is, it's both, and this is like, I think, a point that sort of conservative accounts of this often get wrong, that, part of what happens is the students actually radicalize some of the older, the thing about the 60s is that, I think the standard kind of conservative narrative would be like, you have these like dangerous gurus who are allowed to like radicalize these young minds. And in fact, if you look at it, what happens is kind of the opposite, that these student movements emerge, and in a sense, they are a kind of vanguard, right? Because they are kind of taking things in directions that, their elders are not. And it's actually, something I'll probably publish at some point in the next month or so is on Foucault, who we're reaching about the 40th anniversary of his death. But an interesting thing that's kind of misunderstood about him is that he really was not particularly politically active up until sort of the student revolts. And so it was actually really his interaction with these like, fire-breathing Maoist students that sort of radicalized him. And I think this, so, I don't want to go on for too long, but I think there was something real about the position of students, the ambiguous position of students in society at that kind of transitional moment that led to this radicalization, this kind of accelerated radicalization of that generation. And then that, in a sense, kind of signaled to these older intellectuals like, oh, maybe we've got a new vanguard here, right? And similar things happen with these other ones. They're kind of looking around for, these forces that look like the leading edge of progress to them. And so I don't know. I think it's quite a kind of it's quite an ad hoc process that unfolds in this period.
Somebody here says that, I'll just quote it, I'd be curious to hear from Geoff and Jacob and also David how they see the place of telos in the history of these debates, beginning with Marcuse himself. This is a wonderfully theory-infused debate and meta criticism that we've got going. It's not as if Telos hasn't been a part of that, and somebody wants to know from those who might be able to tell us, while we're on these topics, where does Telos fit in the history of this stuff?
I think Geoff would point to artificial negativity, and to give credit where it's due, Tim Luke's worked on that also with Paul, and developed that critical framework. The Telos's critique of the student new left, as I understand it, and I'm sure David has a more sophisticated understanding than I do, but my read on it is that it understood the new left in part, and this is what artificial negativity gets at, as being integrated within the administrative state and not being a sufficiently external actor to be able to A, protect its own autonomy, and B, meaningfully alter the aspects of the administrative state that make it a kind of menace to freedom in the first place. So, my theory of the student protests in relation to the White House is not that there's direct coordination. It's more what David said, that the students they're all part of the same organization. Ultimately, it doesn't require direct coordination. It shares the same class interests. It shares the same class identity, and it moves in the same direction, which is why, for me, I wish Michael great luck. I'm going to be watching his efforts attentively, but it is hard for me to understand how university administrators could possibly submit to a wholesale alteration of the administrative model of the universities, which is the bedrock of their own position. And so insofar as the university, even the private university, to be clear, right? Like there is no university in America that is more directly aligned with the state. I would argue, apologies to anybody who's implicated in this statement in any way, than Stanford University, which is, Stanford is the hub of the national security complex and is the kind of coordinating. It doesn't mean everybody at Stanford is, but you take my point. So the university exists within that system, and the university student also exists within that system. And Telos's political critique was saying localism, populism at the time, and also localism is a more radical subject than the students, because it at least gets outside of this totalizing administrative apparatus. And I have been very influenced by that point of view, and it I'm sure shows up in my work.
Everything Jacob says is right, but I think it's not the whole story. That's all I want to say.
Well, somebody here is wondering what else you might say, Michael, about. In fact, I have a question here in the chat for you. What would a rebuilt university look like in organizational and pedagogical terms that you're alluding to? Can you be more specific?
Well, for one thing, it would be a university that put its pedagogical mission first. A lot of the research that's currently done by universities would be better done under, corporate independent research institutions, all kinds of things that existed and flourished in this country and produced a lot of important results. See, one of the reasons I think that the whole thing is really open to radical critique is that except at the production of power, the academization of research hasn't been very successful. So it is good at this entry. If we look at what did we get out of the academic public health establishment during COVID, right? We got a lot of censorship and very little progress on actually dealing with the epidemic. So, I think that, this stuff just doesn't get results, right? It just doesn't get results. And the results have gotten worse as the administrative penetration has gotten more severe. So, that's why I think things can be changed. And remember, the administrative bloat is something that has increased very dramatically since I entered the university in 1984, right? The administrative bloat everywhere is much greater. So, sure, these people like their jobs, and sure they want to keep them, and sure they have notions, and they have reasons, and some of their reasons need to be addressed, and some of their reasons have some merit. But I think that what was basically built in a day, we can start to undo it in a day. And obviously it's going to be a long struggle, and the results might not be great, but the results of what we have aren't so great either. And I think that's pretty easy to point out to people who are not invested in the system. Now, the difficulty, which I think is at the back of all of our minds, is, aren't we all really complicit in this, right? Aren't we all really invested in this? Or isn't there too, so how do we, we have to touch people, the mystic chords of memory, the angels of our better nature, right? We're complicit in this, and we have other commitments that we can be reminded of. The university has to be advancing America. And insofar as it's not, they have to be pulled up short, reminded their privileges depend on that. And universities that fail to step in line will have those privileges taken away. Just like Bob Jones University, right? Once the priority of America became equal citizenship for Black people and white people, Bob Jones University was told, you have to get with it or you're losing valuable privileges. And those privileges were taken away and they were not restored until Bob Jones University fell in line. So, that in a way is the model.
The big turning point in this discussion in Telos was the reception of Schmidt. And one of the key points about that, I think, was there was, combined with that, in essentially a critique of Marcuse and that idea of a kind of, desublimation or, that all release of suppression is somehow good. Ultimately, I think it goes back to really Rousseau and Hobbes, right? Because, the fundamental perspective that you get from the student protest, and actually, I really think it's much more the faculty than the students that are really pushing this in some sense. But the fundamental idea comes from Rousseau that the people itself is inherently good, and there's no differentiation between people and people. Whereas if you follow kind of the Hobbes line or really the Schmidt line, it makes a huge difference how the people represent themselves to themselves. I mean, Hobbes is about representation. It's about representation is ultimately about values. What values do that people embody? And that's the crucial question. It's not if you're just the people and somehow you're good because you're the people. And that's the perspective that you get, in a sense, from Marcuse, and in a sense from the current protesters and the faculty that support the protesters, where we have to take this other approach where the representation of the people, which is to say the values that are being espoused by the people as their values, that's the key question. And you need to understand those values and really understand what's politically at stake and also which side to be on, in a sense, right? How do you make these political decisions about what to repress and what not to repress? Because there's going to be repression. This is the interesting thing I liked about Geoff's presentation, is that he's really emphasizing the way in which Marcuse, who's really the theorist of releasing all repression, right, ends up creating this whole system of repression. And that this comes from the sort of post-World War II situation in Germany. Obviously, you can't avoid repression, right? Just like, well, I guess Michael was sort of indicating, you can't avoid settler colonialism. It's every people in the world that exists on the earth is there because they somehow chased away or killed or eliminated some other people that were living there previously. So that's the issue. And then the issue is then what are the values that are being held? What are the values that are being espoused when you're enforcing a particular kind of repression? And that's, I think, where the debate has to lie. And this is, I think this is the way Telos has gone. Is that consistent critique, not consistent, but developing critique of this idea that that all repression is somehow bad, and that, but shifting to the question of values then. So I have to give a shout out to my doctoral student, or our doctoral student, Jonas Weaver, who kind of laid out a lot of this in his dissertation that he just defended last week about post-war Germany.
Can I add something to that?
Terrific.
There's look, I think that in understanding the role of the student, there is a element of kind of European vanguardism that comes in part from Marcuse and part from other Marxist theorists and post-Marxist theorists of the Frankfurt School. But I don't think, I would push back on elements of Geoff's version of this by saying that I don't think any of this takes hold in the way that it does if it is not consonant with a pre-existing, deeply embedded, pre-existing progressive strain in American politics that has already centered higher education as the master apparatus of social engineering and the moral tutelary force, not only for America, but progressivism in the American version was global in its tutelary mission, more or less from the beginning. It's very explicit racial and colonial dimensions to that as well, of course, with Root and others. But if the progressive element was not there, it wouldn't, in my estimation, have taken root in the way that it did. Because the evidence for that is that the student body identifies with the administration in exactly the ways that we've talked about. And that identification with the administration, that when there's graffiti on the wall that, uses a foul epithet or something, it's a sense that we have been let down by the institution which allowed this to happen and which is supposed to enact our values. Our values, of course, being, in some sense, the perfection of the institution's value, because that's what the kind of student vanguard, it is a kind of quasi-revolutionary force in perpetuity, because it has this homeostasis with the administration, who it makes demands on, but then submits to, but then makes demands on, but then submits to, and who eventually it is aiming to merge with, on the career ladder. So it's this strange kind of syncretic blend of revolutionary aspirations and the kind of progressive mission that gives this its lasting power in American life and makes it so that it's not just a kind of brief episodic thing that burns itself out, but it becomes a fixture of the scene in this country.
We're going to wrap up with Julius's question. I think it's probably the perfect way to conclude. I have to say, I didn't notice the student insurrectionists seeing through anything with the sort of kind of innocence of a child, that reaches some kind of truth. They weren't seeing through anything that I could detect on those campuses, shouting for our blood. Be that as it may, Julius asked, or he says that there's a joke been going around, apparently, I'm not sure where, that Adorno would have called the police. The old story about, I guess, sort of how his life ended. I won't repeat it, but Adorno would have called the police is apparently a sentiment that's been circulating either jokingly or perhaps approvingly. I'm not sure. Julius mentions it for your comment as we finally conclude with the thing I thought I would be remiss if I didn't ask, because I have some friends interested in these issues who are not critical theorists, but who wonder what does this debate about free speech and so on and academic have to teach us about how we're going to address the concerns of our Jewish students and their families?
I wouldn't send
Michael. Jacob.
Yes.
You wouldn't send them?
No, absolutely not. I wouldn't send them. And if they were, I certainly wouldn't I wouldn't send them where? I wouldn't send them to universities that have been inculcating ideologies that were perfectly consistent with the eruptions of pro-Hamas sentiment on October 8th, and then act shocked and scandalized that these places that had been openly discriminating against Asian applicants, had been openly inculcating ferocious, sociopathic, kind of anti-white ideologies, had extended that same ideology to Jews, which it had implicitly encompassed all along anyway. I wouldn't be shocked that institutions that had been promoting a kind of revolutionary bloodlust as a student curriculum item, that these kids acted this stuff out on October 8th. And in addition to not being shocked that happened at these places where you could see it predictably developing in slow motion for 2 decades. What I absolutely would not have done if I did find my children there was to have them plead for the protection of the same administrators whose whole job is to enforce a kind of racial caste system at these universities. I think that, to put it sharply, as you asked for, I think that the response by many Jewish students in America and their parents has been self-defeating, weak, confused, lacking any strategic forethought, lacking any genuine understanding of the relationship of Jews to Israel. And I don't just mean the current Israeli government. I mean the nation of Israel that has existed for thousands of years. And so, unfortunately, there is no quick fix at these places, which, as we've been saying all along, are kind of servants of the state. Well, if this in some sense is the ideology of the ruling party, then it expresses itself in the credentialing institutions of that ruling party. And you have to make a decision ultimately. This is the decision that Jews and other people have to make. Do you want to burnish your credentials within that ruling party? Or are you willing to actually be an outsider? Are you willing to sacrifice the status, and to put it in Jewish historical terms, are you willing to sacrifice the Hellenistic status to look out for your own interests? And if you're not willing to do that, and if all you really want to do is carve out an exception for yourself so that you have some bubble of, sort of DEI protections within institutions that are committed to racialist ideologies, don't be surprised when that bubble collapses on your head, as it certainly will.
I know Jacob's a veteran. I can't help thinking that if I were a parent in America of Jewish kids, that I would have a serious talk about sending them to Israel to join the IDF before I would send them to Harvard or Yale.
Yeah, so that would be one practical answer, and then they'll probably age out of wanting to go to an elite American university, which is what happened to all my kids, somewhat against my will. But there's at a very practical level, pretty much every American elite universities, and a lot of non-elite ones, now have a Chabad rabbi who works with students, who monitors the situation. Chabad have been experts for more than 200 years at the dialectic of collaboration and resistance, right? They were the ones who took the side of the Tsar against all the other rabbis who took the side of Napoleon. So they have a very, very sophisticated institutional knowledge about collaboration and resistance. And so I would simply, when you're visiting on campus or after the visit, just talk to the Chabad rabbi, see what he thinks the situation is, okay? And see what he thinks about the situation on his campus and whether because he talks all the time to his colleagues, whether other schools that you're considering might be better or worse.
I think there's been a lot of conflation. I mean, and this relates to the free speech topic of sort of free speech with other things, and this whole, in the past several months around these protests. And, I would simply say that there are plenty of rules that were being violated that could simply be enforced that didn't really, in a way that, doesn't violate anyone's right to express opinions. And so, I think as far as what is to be done, I found, part of what I found frustrating was there was sort of a way that any kind of activity was seen as, was seen as somehow, or was confused with the content of speech. And so I guess I would sort of lean on, given the regime that we have, which I have all kinds of objections to, there are simply ways of enforcing rules. And, even though I think the university is hollowed out and, has kind of become this extremely confused space, I think, there are basic things that need to be preserved in terms of its functions. And so I think there are ways of addressing a lot of this that just have to do with enforcing rules that ensure, the basic functions of the university continue. So I don't know. I find I found there was surprisingly little just kind of reliance on that, which, I think wouldn't even necessarily have to involve the police. And, then, just the disciplinary apparatus of the university itself, right? Which of course speaks to this kind of question of like, okay, are you willing to risk your elite credentialing? If this is what you really believe, are you willing to risk your elite credentialing to say it in a particular way and to engage in certain actions? Like, I feel like that was just a test that should have been imposed more. And so, yeah, I think even though I think so I would lean more on that end of things and, be very skeptical of, again, the kind of extension of this framework that I think this framework that I derived from Matsuda's account that I think largely explains how a lot of the stuff works. I've seen a lot of response that does seem to explicitly or implicitly kind of demand that be extended further, or that the emphasis of it be placed in different areas, but essentially that it be preserved and expanded, which goes along with the preservation and expansion of a kind of bureaucratic apparatus. So I suppose that's my practical response.
Very good. We've had a practical response in the end from all of you, and we've touched on practicalities throughout. We've explored critical theory critically, and we've also addressed practical matters. I should thank at this point the audience for its indulgence, if not its endurance. We've gone over like we never have before through the sheer momentum of the force of these men's intellects here before you. Thank you, Geoff Shullenberger. Thank you, Michael Kochin. Thank you, Jacob Siegel.